So I want you to just imagine standing at the dawn of the year 1700. Like, just picture it.
Right. A totally different world.
Exactly. If you unfold a map of the world right then, your eyes are immediately drawn to this massive, seemingly invincible block of imperial power.
Yeah, it basically stretches from the gates of Vienna all the way to, the archipelagos of Southeast Asia.
It's just staggering. You are looking at the absolute height of four colossal geopolitical titans. So in the West, you have the Ottoman Empire, right?
Oh, yeah. A vast, incredibly sophisticated administrative machine.
Right, and they're just dictating the flow of global trade across three continents.
Hmm.
Then, just to their east, you've got the Safavids in Persia.
Who were presiding over this amazing cultural and architectural majesty.
Yeah, the art in the cities there were just unreal. And then moving further east, you hit the mighty Mughal Empire in India.
Which was, practically groaning under the weight of its own immense agrarian and mercantile wealth.
Totally, just incredibly rich. And finally, spanning the crucial maritime choke points of the eastern seas, you have the sultanates of Indonesia.
Right, so that's four immense pillars of military capability, economic dominance, and high culture.
But, and this is where it gets wild, if you fast forward a mere 150 years, which is, just a brief exhalation in historical time.
It's nothing.
It really is nothing. So you unfold that exact same map in 1850, and the landscape is completely unrecognizable. Every single one of these titans is either entirely dismantled, geographically carved up, or just gasping for breath on systemic life support.
It's a spectacular, almost unbelievable evaporation of global dominance.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today for this deep dive is to really analyze this specific window, roughly 1700 to 1850.
Right, which is an era frequently designated as the Dark Age of the Muslim world.
Exactly. We're going to dissect the specific mechanics behind this breathtaking political and intellectual collapse.
But, we aren't going to leave you solely in the ruins.
No, definitely not. We're also going to explore this phenomenal counter-movement that emerged directly out of the ashes of all this administrative chaos.
The birth, evolution, and just explosive literary flourishing of the Urdu language.
Yeah, which is such a beautiful silver lining. But before we get to the art, we have to look at the collapse.
Well, it remains one of the most drastic hemispheric inversions in recorded history.
Right.
To truly grasp the magnitude of this collapse, you have to place it against the backdrop of what is simultaneously occurring in the West.
Right, because Europe isn't just sitting still during this 150-year descent.
Exactly. This period directly intersects with Europe's aggressive awakening from its own historical lethargy. As the administrative frameworks of these four Eastern empires begin to, basically ossify, Europe is metabolizing the delayed yields of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment.
So they're building momentum while the East is stalling.
Precisely. They are fundamentally restructuring their economic models around joint stock capitalization. They're developing advanced maritime navigation.
Which is huge for trade and war.
Huge.
Yeah.
And they're refining metallurgy for artillery, formalizing new philosophical frameworks regarding the state and the individual.
So you basically have two massive spheres of human civilization passing each other in opposite directions on the historical escalator.
That's a great way to put it. The sheer velocity of this contrast is what triggers the massive geopolitical flip.
Right.
The powers that had operated as the undisputed hegemons of the known world suddenly find themselves outmaneuvered structurally, outgunned technologically, and ultimately dismantled piece by piece.
And to really understand the anatomy of a macro collapse of that scale, we really have to look at the most prominent of these empires, the Ottomans.
Really big.
Because we need to examine how this structural rot takes root at the very apex of the executive branch. An entity as massive as the Ottoman Empire doesn't just, accidentally stumble into obsolescence.
No, not at all.
It is steered there through highly specific institutional failures. So let's look at Suleiman the Magnificent.
A fascinating figure.
He really is. He represents the culmination of a 300-year streak of 10 highly effective, strategically brilliant sultans.
The ultimate peak.
Yeah. Under his administration, the empire achieves its absolute zenith in territorial reach and legal codification. But the architectural blueprints for the empire's eventual demise are drafted right at the end of his reign.
Right. He introduces this seemingly minor yet ultimately fatal administrative shift.
Yes. He formally withdraws from direct physical participation in the Council of State, the Divan.
Which used to be very hands-on.
Exactly. Instead of sitting among his viziers, actively debating policy and, measuring the temperament of his advisors face to face, he opts to listen to the proceedings from behind a latticework window.
The grill, or the veil.
Yeah, the veil.
The psychological and institutional shift created by that physical barrier, I mean, it really cannot be overstated.
I can imagine.
When Suleiman stepped behind that veil, he fundamentally transformed the mechanism of Ottoman governance. He transitioned from being the chief executive actively wrestling with statecraft.
Right, to a passive observer.
Exactly. And the precedent he set was completely weaponized by his successors.
Right, they took it even further.
Oh, they dropped the formality of the grill entirely. They simply stopped attending the Council of State.
Wow.
They withdrew into the deep interior of the palace, isolating themselves within the harem and surrounding themselves exclusively with sycophants.
Which is just a recipe for disaster.
Completely. When the sovereign physically removes himself from the arena of debate, the quality of administrative advice just loses its value.
This is all about access now.
Precisely. What becomes paramount is proximity to the sovereign. The entire metric for advancement shifted from merit and capability to flattery and access.
So the decision-making apparatus of a transcontinental empire basically became dangerously arbitrary.
That's exactly it.
It's the equivalent of a CEO suffering from terminal founder syndrome, right? A CEO who just completely abandons the boardroom.
Yes, great analogy.
They lock themselves in a penthouse suite, severing all contact with the factory floor, completely ignoring the R&D department.
And relying entirely on a curated feed of information.
Exactly. A feed heavily filtered by a middle management layer whose only objective is to maintain their own proximity to power. In that environment, the meritocracy immediately evaporates.
And you see this play out in the Ottoman administration with terrifying speed.
Yeah, Suleiman himself actually initiates this, right? By appointing individuals to immense offices of state trust without requiring them to pass through the rigorous lower grades of the bureaucracy.
Right. You have figures like Ibrahim.
Yeah, Ibrahim. He is vaulted from being the master of the pages, which is essentially managing household logistics.
Making sure the palace runs smoothly.
Right, directly to the position of Grand Vizier.
And that normalization of arbitrary promotion initiates a catastrophic top-down degradation of the civil service.
Which makes sense.
What's fascinating here is how, when meritocracy evaporates, it is immediately replaced by a culture of hyper-extortion and wealth hoarding.
Because everyone just wants to grab what they can.
Exactly. You see this perfected by Rustam Pasha, Suleiman's son-in-law, who held the Grand Vizierate for 15 years.
Right.
His primary administrative innovation was systemic extortion. He realized he could inflate the central treasury not through sustainable economic growth, but by levying exorbitant unofficial fees on anyone appointed to a state office.
Oh, wow. So you basically had to pay to play.
Very quickly, this devolves into an outright auction. The office of the provincial tax collector wasn't assigned to the most competent administrator, it was sold to the highest bidder.
That is wild. And this creates a devastating economic feedback loop, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Because if an official has to, mortgage their future to purchase their position, their immediate priority upon taking office is to extract as much wealth from the local agrarian populace as violently and rapidly as possible.
Because they have to recoup their initial capital outlay.
Right. The corruption became so deeply systemic that the state actually adopted a cannibalistic policy.
This part is just staggering.
It is. If a provincial officer became visibly wealthy, the state viewed that wealth as de facto evidence of corruption, executed the officer, and confiscated the estate to refill the imperial coffers.
So the state essentially incentivized its own bureaucracy to operate like a predatory cartel, only to turn around and cannibalize that cartel when the central treasury ran dry.
It is a literal masterclass in economic self-destruction. But while the civilian bureaucracy is tearing itself apart, the military apparatus is undergoing a mutation that is arguably even more dangerous.
Yes, the military.
This brings us to the Janissaries. Historically, the Janissaries were the vanguard of Ottoman military supremacy. Right?
Absolutely. They were a highly disciplined, fiercely loyal, salaried infantry corps.
Originally recruited through the Devshirme system from Christian youths, they were the elite shock troops that made the Ottoman war machine so terrifying.
But as the executive authority of the sultans weakened and isolated itself, the Janissaries realized they held a monopoly on physical force within the capital.
That's a dangerous realization for an army.
Extremely. They morphed from a standing army into a heavily armed, highly reactionary political faction.
Wow.
They transformed into a Praetorian Guard that no longer served the Sultan, but rather dictated who was allowed to sit on the throne, frequently deposing or executing rulers who threatened their privileges.
Which is just the textbook hazard of maintaining a massive standing army in the absence of strong, centralized civilian oversight.
Yes, the Janissaries evolved into an entrenched, vested interest group.
Right.
Their primary objective shifted from defending the empire's borders to defending their own socioeconomic privileges, their salaries, and their political influence.
So they basically became a massive union with weapons.
Exactly. Consequently, they became the fiercest opponents of any military modernization.
Because changing tactics means changing their status.
Right. Adopting European volley fire tactics, modern artillery logistics, or updated organizational structures would require the Janissaries to submit to new training regimens and relinquish their traditional autonomy.
So they just violently suppressed reform.
They kept the Ottoman military artificially frozen in time while European armies were aggressively innovating.
That's terrifying.
The Janissaries became such an existential menace to the internal stability of the state that it wasn't until 1826 that Sultan Mahmud II was forced to engineer a massive internal purge.
Using loyal artillery units to basically systematically annihilate the Janissary Corps in their own barracks.
Yes, but by 1826, the military and technological chasm between the Ottomans and the European powers was virtually unbridgeable.
Too little, too late. And compounding this military stagnation was a diplomatic strategy that systematically surrendered Ottoman sovereignty from within.
Ah, the capitulations.
Capitulations. This is a fascinating mechanism of institutional suicide.
It really is.
Originally, under Suleiman, this began as a calculated, aggressive geopolitical maneuver. To counter the hegemony of the Holy Roman Empire, Suleiman forged a strategic alliance with France.
Right.
And to solidify this, he granted the French specific preferential trade treatments. Most crucially, he granted them the right of extraterritoriality.
Which is a huge deal.
Yeah, this meant that French merchants operating within Ottoman borders were not subject to Ottoman law. They were subject to French law, adjudicated by French consular courts.
And, from a position of absolute strength, granting these concessions probably seemed like a clever diplomatic chess move to secure a European ally.
Right, when you're the big dog, it doesn't seem like a risk.
Exactly. But as the Ottoman state weakened over the subsequent centuries, the dynamic completely flipped.
Oh, I bet.
Every other emerging European power, the British, the Russians, the Austrians, they all demanded the exact same legal and economic concessions.
And the Ottoman state simply lacked the leverage to refuse.
Right, and the long-term domestic damage inflicted by the capitulations is almost difficult to comprehend.
Because it wasn't just about trade anymore.
No, it went far beyond surrendering economic leverage. These legal carve-outs effectively fractured the internal cohesion of the Ottoman populace. You had millions of Christian subjects living within the Ottoman borders, Greeks, Armenians, Orthodox Slavs. As these foreign European powers established their consular courts and flexed their diplomatic immunity, the Ottoman Christian subjects began looking toward Paris, London, and St. Petersburg for legal patronage and physical protection.
Completely bypassing the authority of the Sultan.
Exactly. Their political loyalty was cleaved in two.
That is wild.
The European powers explicitly utilized these capitulations as a mechanism for constant internal intervention. They were perpetually claiming they were simply exercising their legal right to protect their religious brethren within the Sultan's domains.
So it was basically a diplomatic Trojan horse that hollowed out the state's sovereignty from the inside.
Precisely. There is a chilling phrase in the historical analysis that perfectly encapsulates the totality of this phenomenon. The Ottoman Empire died of Europe.
The Ottoman Empire died of Europe. That phrasing captures the insidious nature of the collapse perfectly.
It really does.
So if we look at the Ottomans, their demise is characterized by this slow-motion, internal administrative isolation, reactionary military stagnation, and European economic infiltration. But let's shift our focus to the East. If the Ottomans died of a creeping systemic illness, the Safavids in Persia and the Mughals in India died from a combination of catastrophic executive negligence and intense geographical suffocation.
It was a much more acute geographical problem.
Yeah. Starting with Persia, the Safavid Empire, which was formalized in 1499 by Shah Ismail, reached its absolute cultural and military zenith under Shah Abbas the Great.
A truly golden age.
But immediately following his reign, Persia experiences the exact same phenomenon as the Ottomans, right? A continuous succession of exceedingly cruel, utterly incompetent rulers who display a complete disinterest in the mechanics of statecraft or the survival of their own borders.
Yeah, and the velocity of Persia's geopolitical contraction during this period is just severe,
I mean, how fast are we talking?
incredibly fast. While the Safavid leadership retreated into profound isolation and arbitrary cruelty, the global map was rapidly shrinking around them. Persia essentially becomes the primary victim of imperial encirclement.
Serving as the crucible for the early stages of the Great Game.
Exactly. To understand this, you have to look at the ripple effects of global conflicts. When Napoleon launched his Egyptian campaign in 1798, it sent absolute shockwaves through the British establishment.
Because they're worried about India, right?
Yes, the British perceived a French presence in the Middle East as a direct stepping stone to their most lucrative colonial possession, India.
So they have to buffer it.
Right. To preempt any overland threat, the British began aggressively securing their western flank, pushing deep into Persian diplomatic and economic affairs from the east and south.
While someone else is coming from the north?
Exactly. Simultaneously, an increasingly industrialized, expansionist Russian empire was pressing down relentlessly from the north, seeking warm water ports and buffer zones.
So Persia was literally trapped in an imperial vice.
They were reduced to a proxy battleground. Their sovereignty was completely compromised, forced into treaties that exclusively promoted the strategic interests of whichever foreign power held the immediate military advantage.
They are geographically and diplomatically squeezed into irrelevance. And what is so striking in the historical record is the internal response to this existential pressure.
Which was what?
It is essentially non-existent. The analysis points out that throughout this entire prolonged period of encirclement and slow strangulation, the Persian society failed to produce a single thinker of repute in any branch of philosophy, science, or statecraft.
There's a crushing, pervasive intellectual apathy.
Exactly. And if we look directly next door to the Mughal Empire in India, the narrative is tragically identical, though the physical dismantling is far more violent.
Right, much more explosive.
Following the death of the Emperor Aurangzeb in 1707, the central authority of this incredibly wealthy, diverse subcontinent is handed down to a lineage of rulers described in the sources quite bluntly as sensuous, negligent weaklings.
And the decentralization of the Mughal Empire happens at breakneck speed.
Right, because it was so massive.
The Mughal apparatus relied on a delicate balance of regional governors and tribute networks. The absolute second, the central authority in Delhi demonstrated fatal weakness. The periphery violently detached itself.
Everyone just makes a run for it.
Yes. You see massive, coordinated internal revolts from various factions. Hindu confederacies and warrior groups, the Rajputs, the Satnamis, the Sikhs, and the Jats, they all initiate aggressive campaigns.
Driven by a vision of reclaiming the subcontinent and establishing a revived Hindu geopolitical dominance, right?
Exactly. And concurrently, the regional Muslim governors in massive wealthy provinces like the Deccan, Oud, and Bengal, they simply stopped sending tribute to Delhi.
Just cut them off.
Yeah, effectively declaring themselves independent sovereign states. The illusion of a unified Mughal India shattered into a mosaic of deeply antagonistic competing fragments.
And it is precisely at this moment of maximum internal fragmentation that the external invasions begin.
The worst possible timing.
In 1739, Nadir Shah sweeps in from Persia. He breaches Delhi, massacres the civilian population, and systematically drains the empire of its accumulated legendary wealth.
Taking everything from the royal treasuries to the Peacock Throne itself.
Yeah, the invasion leaves the Mughal state financially eviscerated. And before the agrarian base can even recover, Ahmad Shah Abdali launches a relentless series of invasions spanning from 1748 to 1767.
Which completely shattered the remaining logistical and military infrastructure of the Mughal army.
Right. So you are left with a subcontinent that is economically crippled, militarily defunct, and fractured into dozens of paranoid, warring fiefdoms.
And right into the middle of this bloody chaos steps the British.
Right. And they do not arrive as a conquering royal army.
No, they don't.
They arrive as a multinational corporation, the East India Company. It's the ultimate realization of the doctrine that the flag follows trade. But, I have to pose a serious challenge to this standard historical narrative here.
Okay, let's hear it.
The conventional view often relies heavily on the intellectual stagnation of these local Indian and Persian rulers, painting them as naive for allying with European trading companies against their own neighbors.
Yes, that is the standard narrative.
But I struggle to accept that this was purely a failure of local intellect. I mean, weren't the British simply employing an incredibly well-funded, unprecedented style of asymmetric corporate warfare?
That's a fair point.
Like, a traditional land-based agrarian kingdom couldn't possibly conceptualize the threat of a joint stock company backed by industrialized naval logistics. Is it really fair to blame local stagnation when they were facing a completely alien method of conquest?
That is a highly valid pushback, and it forces us to define what we actually mean by intellectual stagnation in this context.
Right, because it's not about them just being unintelligent.
You are absolutely correct that the corporate mechanics of the East India Company, its ability to raise capital in London to fund proxy wars in Bengal, was a structural innovation completely alien to the traditional Mughal successor states.
Right, they had no framework for that.
However, the stagnation lies precisely in the refusal to analyze and adapt to that new reality.
Oh, I see.
When the Europeans arrived, showcasing superior naval architecture, advanced artillery casting, and highly disciplined infantry drills, the local potentates did not engage in a systemic study of how the Europeans achieved these advancements.
They didn't try to reverse engineer the success.
Exactly. They did not attempt to replicate the institutional frameworks that produced those weapons. Instead, they viewed the British merely as heavily armed, highly competent mercenaries.
Wow, just guns for hire.
Yes. They eagerly traded away long-term structural autonomy, granting the East India Company tax collection rights in key provinces in exchange for short-term access to modern artillery.
Just to settle petty regional vendettas with neighboring princes.
Precisely. The failure of intellect was a failure of imagination. They were so myopically consumed by their immediate traditional rivalries that they failed to recognize that the rules of global power had fundamentally changed.
And the British capitalized on this flawlessly.
Oh, flawlessly. They formed fluid alliances, fighting one local power using the resources of another, until the East India Company stood as the undisputed paramount power on the subcontinent.
It's just wild. The 1857 War of Independence was the final, desperate convulsion of a traditional system, realizing far too late that it had been completely outmaneuvered.
And that conflict ended with the last Mughal emperor exiled to Rangoon, officially extinguishing the empire.
So the failure wasn't necessarily a lack of raw intelligence, but a failure of institutional adaptation. They tried to play a new game using the old rules, and it literally cost them a continent.
Which provides the perfect thematic transition to our next geography, further east to Indonesia.
Yes, because if the British takeover India was a slow, opportunistic, mercantile creep, what occurred in the Indonesian archipelago was a highly engineered, centuries-long project of total corporate extraction.
This wasn't merely a shifting of diplomatic boundaries.
No, it was the construction of a massive wealth-draining machine. The European incursions here began with the Portuguese in the early 1500s.
Right, men like Almeida and Albuquerque.
Yeah, who captured the crucial choke point of Malacca in 1511. And the Portuguese arrived with a deeply integrated dual mandate. They wanted to serve God, driven by the intense crusading evangelism of figures like Francis Xavier.
Right.
And they wanted to serve Mammon by completely violently seizing control of the incredibly lucrative Arab spice trade.
And the Portuguese strategy was fundamentally defined by this crusading zeal. Their objective was a monopoly enforced by absolute naval terror, aimed squarely at destroying the economic foundation of the Islamic trading networks in the Indian Ocean.
But they couldn't hold it, right?
No, their demographic and logistical capacity was ultimately too limited to hold such a vast archipelago. The Spanish contested them briefly, but the enduring architectural framework of colonial Indonesia was built by the Dutch,
who arrived in 1595 and maintained their grip all the way until 1949.
a massive span of time. And the Dutch approach, operating through the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, was entirely distinct from the Portuguese.
They didn't care about religion as much.
Right. They were not interested in religious conversion or ideological crusades. They were purely interested in maximum economic optimization.
Which is chilling in its own way.
Very. To achieve this, they implemented a devastatingly effective system of indirect administration. Instead of expending Dutch blood and treasure to rule the massive Indonesian populace directly, they identified the most pliant, morally compromised native aristocrats they could find.
Wow.
The Dutch propped these local elites up with modern military backing, with one simple condition. These aristocrats had to enforce draconian agricultural quotas on their own people.
So it's the ruthless outsourcing of oppression.
Exactly.
The Dutch sit at the top of the pyramid, utilizing the native nobility as the enforcement mechanism. But they added another layer to this social stratification that made it virtually impossible to dismantle, didn't they?
They did. The Dutch actively imported and elevated the Chinese demographic, positioning them as an intermediary trading and merchant class.
So you have a perfectly insulated hierarchy.
Right. The Dutch holding the monopoly on violence and international export at the apex.
The Chinese handling the complex domestic commerce, credit, and tax farming in the middle.
The corrupt native aristocrats acting as the localized enforcers.
And the native Indonesian peasantry, absolutely crushed at the foundational level, deliberately severed from any participation in the broader market economy.
It's a closed system. And the apex of this extractive logic was the Kulturstelsel, the cultivation system.
Yeah, the mechanics of the system were just horrific. Native peasants were forced to dedicate a massive percentage of their arable land to growing specific cash crops dictated by the Dutch.
Things like sugar, coffee, indigo.
Right, rather than cultivating rice or subsistence crops for their own survival. To pay the crushing taxes imposed on them, these peasants were forced into high-interest debt traps managed by the Chinese creditor class.
And they could only service these debts by selling their export crops at artificially depressed prices dictated by those same creditors.
It was an inescapable loop of extortion that predictably resulted in widespread, artificially engineered famines in some of the most fertile land on Earth.
It's tragic. And to ensure that the native population could never organize a systemic challenge to this socioeconomic pyramid, the Dutch executed a policy of total educational and intellectual suppression.
Right. Keep them in the dark.
You really have to contextualize this. This is an archipelago with a profound history of sophisticated maritime trade, complex philosophy, and rich cultural synthesis.
Yeah, it wasn't a blank slate.
Yet, under the Dutch administration, there was a complete blackout of institutional knowledge. The colonial government did not permit the establishment of a single public primary school for the native population until 1850.
That is just evil.
Furthermore, they constructed a library in Batavia in 1846, but legally prohibited native Indonesians from setting foot inside it for nearly 50 years, until 1895.
That specific detail, banning the native population from a library for half a century, highlights the absolute grim efficiency of the colonial strategy.
It really does.
When you simultaneously sever a population from capital by locking them out of the merchant and credit economies and sever them from knowledge by denying them access to basic schooling and libraries, you achieve the ultimate recipe for systemic subjugation. You are intentionally blinding the populace while simultaneously binding their hands.
Precisely. However, if we pull back and synthesize the narratives of all these regions, the bureaucratic collapse of the Ottomans, the violent fracturing of India and Persia, and the economic subjugation of Indonesia, a deeply uncomfortable historical reality emerges from the analysis.
Okay, what's that?
It is undeniable that the European powers were technologically advanced, diplomatically ruthless, and brilliantly opportunistic, but their success was entirely predicated upon capitalizing on profound pre-existing internal fractures.
The rot was already there.
Exactly. The imperial projects of the 18th and 19th centuries were massively facilitated by the internal moral, structural, and intellectual bankruptcy of the Muslim societies themselves. The doors of these empires were indeed battered down from the outside, but the internal locking mechanisms had already completely rotted away from years of neglect.
Which transitions us perfectly into the core why of this deep dive.
Right.
We have charted the physical collapse, we've watched the administrative maps redraw themselves, the treasuries drain, and the port cities fall under foreign flags. But why were the internal structures of these societies so incredibly brittle?
That is the central question.
To answer that, we have to examine the profound shift in the psychology of the Muslim world during this period. We are delving into the mechanics of the intellectual dark age.
Yeah.
And the absolute epicenter of this intellectual collapse is the systemic abandonment of a theological and legal principle known as ijtihad. For centuries, ijtihad, the principle of independent reasoning, critical inquiry, and continuous reinterpretation of Islamic jurisprudence, acted as the engine of these societies.
It was the dynamic framework that allowed Muslim scholars to synthesize Greek philosophy, advance mathematics, pioneer optics, and lead the world in medical sciences.
The society was incredibly adaptable. But then it just halts.
Completely flatlines.
For a period of 150 years across these four massive empires, the historical record shows zero scientists, physicists, or philosophers of global repute. The intellectual output simply flatlines.
The institutional death of Ittihad is really the defining tragedy of this era.
Yeah.
What replaced this dynamic framework of inquiry was a concept known as taqlid, which translates to strict, unquestioning imitation.
So just copying what was done before.
Exactly. The complex religious, legal, and civic rulings formulated by jurists centuries earlier, designed for deeply different socioeconomic realities, were suddenly elevated to the status of infallible dogma, applicable for all time.
The civilization became conceptually immobile.
And to enforce this immobility, the conservative establishment constructed a highly destructive false dichotomy. As the scientific revolution blossomed in Europe, these traditionalists aggressively condemned modern empirical science,
Labeling it as inherently materialistic, subversive, and intrinsically anti-religious, right?
Right. Instead of adopting the new scientific methodologies of the West and adapting them to their own ethical frameworks, which is exactly what they had done with Greek philosophy centuries prior, they rejected the tools of modernity entirely out of profound institutional fear.
The best way I can conceptualize this civilizational retreat is by looking at it through the lens of technical debt in software engineering.
Oh, that's an interesting way to frame it.
Well, think about it. For centuries, these empires ran on a highly advanced, adaptable societal operating system.
Right.
But as the external variables of the world began to change radically, the dawn of globalized maritime trade, early industrialization, new military technologies, the leadership simply refused to update the OS.
They insisted on running the empire using legacy code written centuries ago.
Exactly. And just like in software, if you ignore the updates long enough, the technical debt compounds until the entire system becomes hopelessly incompatible with the modern world, and it crashes.
Right. It just breaks down.
Faced with an intimidating, rapidly accelerating global environment, these societies didn't debug the system. They essentially unplugged the machine and retreated into the comfort of outdated manuals.
That is a highly precise analogy. When a society systematically refuses to update its analytical frameworks, it inevitably replaces empirical inquiry with superstition.
Right.
We see this manifested perfectly in the catastrophic degradation of mysticism during this dark age.
Right. Sufism.
Historically, Islamic mysticism, Sufism, was a profound discipline of spiritual contemplation that produced some of the greatest poetry and philosophical thought in human history. It was a vital, dynamic part of the culture.
But during this period of collapse, mysticism was completely corrupted.
It degenerated from an active spiritual discipline into a mechanism for mass psychological escapism.
Because the real world was too painful.
Exactly. The populace, enduring the trauma of political fragmentation, systemic corruption, and engineered famines, stopped seeking tangible, civic solutions to their material suffering. Instead, they placed their faith entirely in amulets, talismans, shrine worship, and the authority of hereditary spiritual leaders known as peers.
It cultivated a pervasive culture of absolute fatalism. The psychological response to material crises completely fundamentally shifted.
Right.
If a city was struck by an epidemic, a devastating flood, or mass starvation, these events were no longer viewed as civic challenges that required the engineering of better sanitation systems, the construction of reinforced levees, or the implementation of anti-corruption measures.
They were passively accepted as the unavoidable dictates of fate.
The entire concept of social ethics, of proactive humanitarian welfare, simply vanished from the civic discourse. I mean, why invest the capital to build a hospital if you believe the pathogen is merely the undeniable will of the cosmos?
Exactly.
Why risk your life to overthrow an extortionist provincial governor if your entire spiritual focus is directed toward praying at a local shrine for a more favorable outcome in the afterlife? It represents a total society-wide abdication of civic agency.
And this fatalism was aggressively encouraged by the hereditary peers.
Yeah.
These figures essentially functioned as spiritual feudal lords.
Leveraging the despair.
Yes, they claimed to possess a direct, exclusive conduit to the divine and demanded absolute, unquestioning submission from their followers.
Wow.
The populace was systematically instructed that the application of critical reason was a dangerous, arrogant, and ultimately heretical exercise. When a society's intellectual class actively demonizes reason and its administrative class is singularly focused on cannibalizing the treasury, the civilization is functionally necrotic.
It is merely occupying space, waiting for an external geopolitical force to finally knock it over.
Right.
The historical reality of this period is undeniably bleak. We are looking at a century and a half defined by entrenched corruption, immense human suffering, and deliberate intellectual suicide.
It's very heady.
It is, but, and this is why the study of history is endlessly fascinating, right at the absolute nadir of this collapse, we witness a stunning, almost miraculous cultural counter-movement.
Silver lining.
Yes, while the grand political architecture of the Mughal Empire was rotting from the emperor down to the provincial governors, a vibrant, complex, new cultural synthesis was organically forging itself from the bottom up.
Right in the dust of the streets and the crowded bazaars of the Indian subcontinent.
Exactly. We are talking about the genesis of the Urdu language. This is the profound silver lining of the Dark Age.
It truly is a phenomenal sociolinguistic event. And the deep irony of its creation is embedded right in its etymology.
Oh, this is fascinating. Tell them about the name.
Well, the word Urdu itself is derived from a Turkic root meaning camp, army post, or horde, the same root that gives us the English word whore. The term was introduced to the subcontinent much earlier by Babur, the founder of the Mughal dynasty, and originally it merely designated the rough, pragmatic pidgin spoken in the royal military encampments and the sprawling, chaotic bazaars that followed the armies.
I want you to really visualize that environment. An army camp. A space inherently defined by transience, logistical chaos, the threat of violence, and the collision of disparate peoples.
A very raw environment.
Very raw. And out of that incredibly gritty utilitarian environment emerges what will eventually become one of the most structurally sophisticated and profoundly lyrical languages in human history.
It's incredible.
The geographic incubator for this was primarily the Punjab and the environs of Delhi. You had waves of Muslim soldiers, administrators, and merchants arriving, bringing with them their distinct linguistic operating systems.
The administrative polish of Persian, the muscular military vocabulary of Turkish, and the deep theological and scientific lexicon of Arabic.
Right. And on a daily basis, in the markets, the barracks, and the streets, they are colliding and transacting with the local Hindu populations who are speaking various foundational Indo-Aryan Prakrits, specifically regional dialects like Apabramsa and Kariboli.
And what occurs is not a conquest of one language over another.
No.
It's a seamless, organic integration. They essentially took the foundational syntax and grammar from the local languages and heavily populated it with the specialized vocabulary of the incoming languages, compiling an entirely novel linguistic architecture.
A total mashup.
Exactly. And it is crucial to understand that for decades, this new hybrid was strictly a utilitarian language of the streets. It carried zero prestige.
Because Persian was still the language of the elite. Right.
Persian remained the exclusive elite language of the Mughal court, the high administration, and formal literature. But Urdu possessed a raw, communicative vitality that made it undeniably effective.
And the people who really realized its potential first were the Sufi mystics.
Yes. Interestingly, the primary catalysts for its spread were the Sufi mystics. These spiritual teachers recognized a fundamental truth of mass communication.
You got to speak the language of the people.
Exactly. If they intended to preach and connect with the broader, common populace, they could not deliver their sermons in the elevated, inaccessible Persian of the elite. They had to speak the evolving language of the bazaar.
So they adopted this rough camp dialect for their poetry and their missionary work.
And as they utilized it, they refined it. The language slowly began to climb the socioeconomic ladder, moving from the street to the merchant class, then to the lesser nobility, until eventually it breached the walls of the palace itself.
That is quite the glow-up for a language.
It really is. By the twilight of the Mughal era, kings were patronizing it, and the final emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, was himself a highly accomplished, celebrated Urdu poet.
It is the ultimate testament to a joint Hindu-Muslim cultural synthesis. Yes, the Muslim demographics were the primary architects in terms of actively injecting the foreign vocabulary and the advanced Perso-Arabic phonetic structures, but the language was entirely forged in the crucible of daily, unavoidable interaction with the Hindu populace.
The resulting linguistic cocktail is extraordinary.
The historical analyses we are drawing from describe the synthesis beautifully. Urdu managed to seamlessly combine the muscular virility and martial vigor of Turkish, the profound grandeur and intellectual dignity of Arabic, the immense literary polish and aesthetic grace of Persian, and the grounding, relatable homeliness of the local Hindi dialects.
And we really need to look closer at the mechanics of that synthesis.
Let's do it.
Because this blending was not a simple dead equivalence of vocabulary. It wasn't merely a matter of finding a local word and replacing it with a Persian synonym.
It fundamentally changed how people could think.
Yes. When Urdu absorbed vocabulary from Arabic and Persian, it fundamentally expanded the conceptual horizon of the people speaking it. It imported entirely new conceptual frameworks related to complex imperial administration, advanced agricultural techniques, refined aesthetics, and nuanced philosophical distinctions that simply did not have direct equivalents in the localized Prakrits.
Wow.
It created a completely unique tone color, a linguistic resonance that allowed speakers to articulate a reality that was rapidly becoming hybrid. It was a language explicitly built to navigate a complex, changing world.
So how exactly did they engineer this hybrid? Like, how do you take the underlying grammar of a local agrarian dialect and hack it with foreign, highly conceptual vocabulary to produce a literary powerhouse capable of supporting high philosophy?
The structural mechanics of Urdu are brilliant.
Explain it to us.
At its foundational core, the engine that drives the language, the verbs, the pronouns, the prepositions, is firmly rooted in Hindi.
Okay, the chast is Hindi.
Right. But upon that localized engine, they layered the complex Persian rules for word compounding and phrase formation, and utilized Arabic terminology for the heavy conceptual lifting.
But there's a specific tweak, right?
Yes, the absolute masterstroke, the genius grammatical tweak that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the language, is the incorporation of a Persian phonetic mechanism known as the Khazra-Izafat.
The Khazra-Izafat. Okay, break that down for us.
The Khazra-Izafat is absolutely central to understanding why Urdu exploded as an unparalleled vehicle for poetic expression. If you look at standard Hindi, when you want to demonstrate spatial relationship or possession, for example, if you want to say the Book of the Boy or the Light of the Moon, you have to rely on standalone connector words, specifically ka, ki, or ki.
Right.
From a poetic standpoint, these connector words are incredibly clunky.
Right.
They occupy valuable syllables, they interrupt the metric flow, and they break the rhythmic momentum of a line.
Which is a nightmare if you're trying to write tightly metered poetry.
Exactly. Persian, however, circumvents this entirely with the Khazra-Izafat. It is not a standalone word. It is simply a short vowel mark, a brief I sound, that is seamlessly appended to the end of a noun to instantly link it to the following modifying word.
Oh, wow. So instead of a disjointed three-word phrase burdened by a preposition, you create a smooth, highly integrated two-word compound.
Yes.
Now, you might be asking yourself, why does this matter? Why should you, as someone interested in the geopolitical collapse of empires, care about a microscopic 300-year-old grammatical tweak regarding a vowel sound?
Well, because the conciseness of a language fundamentally dictates the depth and velocity of the thought it can express.
Say more about that.
When a language's architecture allows a writer to convey a profoundly complex, emotionally layered, or philosophically dense concept in significantly fewer syllables, it intrinsically amplifies the emotional resonance and the intellectual punch of the culture's art.
It creates a staggering economy of words.
Exactly. In the realm of poetry, where strict metric rhythm and syllabic real estate are everything, the Izafat acts as a linguistic superpower. It permitted the Urdu poets of the 18th and 19th centuries to tightly coil massive philosophical arguments or intense romantic agonies into a single, perfectly balanced rhyming couplet.
And the poets of this era capitalized on that hyper-efficient grammatical architecture to an astonishing degree. They took this newly hacked language and began importing and mastering the greatest, most demanding forms of classical Persian poetry.
Right, the poetic forms just exploded.
You see the explosion of the ghazal, these highly structured, brilliantly concise, intensely lyrical poems that navigate the complexities of love, loss, and existential longing, often operating simultaneously on both a romantic and a deeply spiritual level.
They're beautiful. And then you have the rise of the qasida.
Elaborate, structurally complex, and lengthy panegyrics designed to showcase the absolute limits of the poet's vocabulary and mastery of meter. You have the Mathnawi-long, sweeping narrative poems written in rhyming couplets that were utilized to recount massive, epic chains of events or deep philosophical allegories.
And crucially, you have the marthia.
Yes, the elegies.
These were poems of mourning that evolved a highly specific, culturally vital function in Urdu. They were explicitly composed to recount the tragic, heart-wrenching martyrdom at the Battle of Karbala.
For a society watching its own political and social structures violently disintegrate, the Marthia provided a profound psychological mechanism for processing their contemporary trauma through the lens of historical and spiritual tragedy.
It was incredibly cathartic. And amidst all this high art and tragedy, we absolutely cannot overlook the Rekti.
Oh, the Rekti is fascinating.
It is one of the most structurally unique literary forms to emerge from this period. The Recti were poems authored by men, but written entirely from the perspective of women, specifically utilizing the highly distinct colloquial slang, idioms, and domestic references of the zenana, the secluded women's quarters.
Which is just so unexpected given the context.
Right. These poems were frequently comic, highly burlesque, and deeply subversive regarding gender roles and social expectations.
Hmm.
Poets who mastered this form, like Rangjeen and Jan Sahib, demonstrate something incredible about the sociology of the time.
What's that?
It proves that despite the overarching narrative of political collapse, military defeat, and economic depression, there was a deeply vibrant, fiercely playful, and complexly subversive literary culture thriving just beneath the surface of the decay.
It is a literal explosion of creative survival. Now, it is worth noting that while Urdu poetry reached these stratospheric heights, Urdu prose initially struggled to find its footing.
It lagged behind significantly.
For a long time, the prose remained overly flowery, incredibly dense, and bogged down in an attempt to artificially mimic the convoluted, highly ornamented style of the old Persian court elites. It lacked the directness of the poetry.
That is, until the narrative takes a really bizarre turn, and the British Imperial Project inadvertently intervenes in the linguistic evolution.
Yeah, this part is crazy.
In the year 1800, the British East India Company established Fort William College in Calcutta. The explicit purpose of this institution was to train newly arrived British administrators and clerks in the local languages so they could effectively manage the tax and legal systems.
Makes sense for an empire.
However, the British found the existing literary Urdu prose far too convoluted for practical administrative instruction. So the college literally commissioned local scholars and writers to systematically strip away the heavy Persian ornamentation,
Resulting in a much more direct, functional, and grammatically straightforward prose style that the British referred to as Hindustani.
It was entirely conceived as an imperial utility project, just a way to expedite colonial administration. But the unintended consequence was that it forcefully modernized the underlying structure of Urdu prose.
Right. By proving that the language could be utilized effectively in a direct, unornamented manner, the Fort William writers paved the way for the later native geniuses who would truly elevate the prose.
You see this most prominently with the legendary poet Ghalib.
Yes, Khalib.
While he is primarily known for his devastatingly brilliant ghazals, his personal letters, written in a highly emotive, intensely witty, and remarkably conversational Urdu prose, proved that the language didn't need heavy Persian artifice to be profoundly expressive.
And following Ghalib, you have the monumental figure of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. He recognized that for the Muslim populace to survive in the modern era, they had to engage with Western knowledge. He utilized this newly naturalized, simplified Urdu prose to write highly influential essays on modern empirical science, Western philosophy, and urgent social reform. The combined efforts of these writers fundamentally transformed Urdu from a language strictly associated with romantic poetry and collapsing courts into a robust, modern vehicle fully capable of bearing the immense intellectual and scientific weight of the 20th century.
It's an incredible evolution.
Okay, let's step back and synthesize the immense scope of what we've explored today. We have journeyed through one of the most profound historical paradoxes on record.
A true paradox.
On one side of the ledger, we have forensically examined the agonizing, self-inflicted dark age of four once-invincible global empires. We've analyzed the wrested mechanisms of their military power, the systemic, cartel-like rot within their bureaucracies, the intellectual cowardice and fatalism of their leadership,
And the silent, inexorable manner in which foreign corporate entities systematically dismantle their sovereignty.
It is a masterclass in civilizational failure. But on the exact opposite side of that ledger, operating directly within the epicenter of that decay, we witness the indomitable nature of human resilience.
Beautifully said.
The fundamental human imperative to communicate, to process trauma, and to create beauty did not evaporate when the treasuries emptied. It only grew sharper and more urgent. As the physical and political architecture of their society collapsed around them, the people operating in the army camps and the chaotic bazaars forged a breathtaking linguistic masterpiece.
A language of immense poetic power and modern utility that remains one of the most vital, widely spoken languages on the globe today.
It serves as a permanent historical reminder that the institutional health of a state and the cultural vitality of its populace do not inevitably share the same trajectory.
Frequently, the exact same immense sociological pressure that causes a political state to fracture and fail is the precise mechanism that squeezes out a diamond of cultural synthesis.
The governments failed, the militaries were routed, and the elites retreated into fatalism. But the populace adapted, synthesized the fragments of their changing world, and engineered a linguistic tool engineered for both survival and transcendent art.
It's a powerful legacy.
Which leaves me with a final provocative thought for you to consider long after this deep dive concludes. When we look around at the deeply complex modern societies of our own era, societies that may currently be exhibiting signs of severe political gridlock, institutional decay, or seemingly irreversible economic stagnation, where should we really be directing our attention to discern the future?
That's a great question.
Should we be perpetually staring at the capitals, the heavily insulated boardrooms, and the traditional centers of power, agonizing over the visible rot? Or should we be shifting our gaze downward and outward?
To the margin.
Should we be looking at the streets, the digital bazaars, the chaotic margins, and the spaces where distinct cultures are currently colliding? Is it possible that the true, enduring legacy of any era of institutional collapse is never the names of the politicians who oversaw the decline, but rather the novel, hybridized slang, the subversive underground art, and the completely new linguistic frameworks currently being quietly forged by the populace in the background, merely waiting for the right moment in history to speak?
Something to really think about.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep critically exploring the immense hidden histories embedded in the very words you speak every single day.